Um, Welcome to tonight's talk on the Sacrament of Holy Matrimony. The sacrament, is the difference between a wedding in a church and a wedding at the courthouse. And in one, you've got a sacrament, so you've invited God in, you get the grace, and in the other one, you don't. So it's a big difference. And we don't have a lot of time tonight, so I'm going to get to it real quick. But before I do that, I've got to find, where's my clicker? There's my clicker. Okay. We'll do the overview real quick. First, we're going to talk about the characteristics of a sacramental marriage. We're going to talk about saying I do, marriage as it occurs in the Bible, some technicalities, the role of the family, and then sanctifying grace. That's the quick overview. Now, before we start, I've got a quick caveat. A lot of us are familiar with, well, all of us are familiar with a lot of different examples of marriage, right? Maybe you're married. You've got friends that are married. You've got family that's married. You've got marriage all over the place. So you've got all these different things, including those that are less than ideal marriages, right? So you see all sorts of different examples. If we're not careful, we can fool ourselves into thinking that we already know marriage because, well, we've seen a bunch of examples. You sort of average them together, and that's what a marriage is. That's not what it is, okay? As we discuss this sacrament, stay focused on the ideal of the sacrament. Not all the examples you've seen, good and bad. Don't focus on that. Focus on the ideal. Not everything you have seen is a sacramental marriage, first of all, okay? The visual that I can come up with is, if this is the ideal, isn't that pretty? If this is the ideal, let's focus on this, okay? Let's not, as I'm going through this, think about all of the different, we bring in a box of all of these different things. Some of them look very close to this. Maybe just a little bit of a chip, maybe a little bit of this, and then some of them are like broken shards of glass. If I threw them all out here, we'd look there and we go, well, what's a marriage? I don't know, average? Which one am I supposed to copy? Let's copy this one, okay? Focus on the ideal. If as I'm going through this, you go, well, my brother-in-law's marriage is a lot worse than this, or mine was, or mine is, or whatever, don't focus on that. Let's focus on the ideal. I got a very short period of time to go through this, so focus on the ideal. Why? Because some of you here are in the process of maybe getting married. I just met with Jake and Natalie last week, okay? They're about to get married. Some of you also are in that process. You want to know what the ideal is to focus on that, okay? If you're already married and you're not quite ideal, well, then focus on the ideal so you can aim for it. If you don't know what to aim for, you'll never hit it. So let's focus on the ideal. Have I put that one to bed? Okay, done. Now, what are the characteristics of a sacramental marriage? We've got 4. First, free will. Now, this one's really obvious, but we a lot of times skip over this, okay? But it's at the heart of the sacrament. Think about it. Entering into marriage is a proclamation, a public proclamation that I have freely chosen this person. Of all the billions of people in the world, I've chosen freely. This person is the one I want to spend the rest of my life with. That's free will. It's important. Number 2, love. This one's really obvious. We don't skip over it. We think this is everything there is to know about marriage. It's just all about love. There's more than that, but love is important. As I've mentioned before in previous talks, I can't remember which one, there are 4 Greek words in the Bible that are translated into love in English, right? And they're 4 different things: storge, philia, eros, and agape. And in a good marriage, in an ideal marriage, all 4 loves come into play. You're affectionate, you're friends, you're good friends, you've got a romantic interest, and agape. You want the best for the other person. You want to lift that person up. You want to sacrifice for that person. Ultimately, you want to be a team. You want to say you're a partnership, that you like each other, that you love each other, that you trust each other, that you're there for each other, you sacrifice for each other, and you're faithful to each other. All of that comes into that one little short word, love. Third is permanence. This is a big one, okay? A sacramental marriage is a permanent marriage. We're going to talk about this a little bit more. We get this from the till death do us part of the ceremony. And this means that original decision, I've picked this person freely, isn't just a free decision, it's a mature decision, because I'm choosing this person for life. It's not just a casual thing, oh, I'm going to be there until I'm not happy. I'm choosing this person for life. It's a mature decision. And then fourth is fruitfulness. Marriage is oriented towards and ordained by God to bear children. That's one of the purposes. In the very first chapter of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, God tells man and woman to be fruitful and multiply. Love always seeks to create more love. And that's true in a marriage. So these four characteristics that I put up there aren't random. I didn't randomly choose, oh, let's just talk about these four. They come from the three questions that you're asked at the ceremony. First, did you come freely without coercion? That's free will. Do you promise to love and honor each other for the rest of your life? That's love and permanence. Will you accept children lovingly from God and bring them up in the faith? That's fruitfulness. So it's not random. It comes from those three questions. So where does the requirement of permanence come from? I told you permanence is important. Well, Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 says, "This is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two of them become one body." That's a permanent kind of thing. They become one body. That's incredible. God didn't say, man and woman should enjoy each other's company until one of them is unhappy. And he didn't say, well, until the initial embers, burn it. No, it's forever. Okay? Not as long as it's fun, not for a while, forever. They become one body. That's in the Old Testament, very beginning in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, Jesus takes this and takes it up a notch because he was being challenged. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, the Pharisees were coming up to Jesus and challenging him on this concept of divorce because they were being told you can't divorce. And it says, and the Pharisees came up to him and tested him by saying, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Is there any reason I can get rid of my wife? And Jesus came back and said this, have you not read that he who made them from the beginning, God, he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason, made him male and female, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one. So he's repeating what was said at the very, very beginning of the Bible. Now, you could look at that last thing, the two shall become one. You could look at that as a poetic way to say that the two came together as one to create children, right? The sex act. You could say that poetically, unless you read the next couple of verses. Because he goes right from there, the two shall become one, and he says this, so they are no longer two, but one. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. This is not a temporary thing. This is not to create children. This is, they become one. This is what God can do. No man can do this. What God can do is make them one. Now, by the way, that word asunder, it's one of those words that we don't use in common language all the time, but we're familiar with it because we know this phrase, right? What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Asunder means to split. Asunder comes, I think, from a German word Sünde, which is also where we get the word sin. So to rip asunder is to separate. To sin is to separate from God. They have the same root. It's not a good thing to rip asunder or to sin. Not a good thing. And then right after this, the Pharisees continue to challenge Jesus, and they said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and put her away? Why did Moses allow us to do that if we're not allowed to do this? Jesus came back and said, it was for your hardness of heart that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. The original plan for marriage, all the way back at the very beginning, like literally the first page or two of the Bible, become one. What was happening in the Old Testament, what Jesus is referring to here is Moses did allow them to divorce. Why? Because, well, this was back before God had really invested them or put in them some moral character. And what was happening was they're saying, well, until death do you part. And the men were going, okay, fine, I'll kill her. And this was happening so often that Moses decided that, it's better to allow a lesser sin of divorce than a greater sin of all these men killing their wives. But in the beginning, it was not so. This is not the intent. So now that we are a moral people, God can say this isn't what we need, what we should be doing. Okay? So now A commitment to permanence enhances the other characteristics of a sacramental marriage. If we talk about free will, I already mentioned that knowing that it is a permanent relationship means that you're making a more mature decision. You're exercising that free will much more carefully. With love, the greatest form of love, agape, which means seeking the highest good for someone else, permanence helps to increase that. Another way you can say agape, and Jesus uses words to this effect elsewhere, is to love others as you love yourself, right? Which is a real easy way to do it. Don't do to somebody what do unto others as you would have do unto you, and don't do to anybody that you wouldn't want to have done to you. Where is this any more true than within a marriage? You are now one. If you and unfortunately, some spouses do this to one another. They tear down the spouse for a power play. But you're joined, so what happens to you? That doesn't make any sense. In a good, functioning, ideal marriage, you want to be building each other up. You don't want to be, you want to be building each other. You want to be building up your spouse as much as you can because that lifts you. In a true ideal marriage, in a good sacramental marriage, you rise and fall together. Whatever is good for one is good for both. Whatever is bad for one is bad for both. So you want to do good. Do unto others as you shall have done unto you. No more true than in a good sacramental marriage. The permanence also means that there's at least one person in the world whom I can be myself with. At least one person that knows everything about me and won't leave, because we are now one. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 25, the very last verse of chapter 2, it says, "The man and his wife were both naked, yet they felt no shame." A man and wife both naked. There is nothing more vulnerable than standing naked in front of someone. And yet they felt no shame. They felt no insecurity there because they're one. Sort of fits into this. I can ultimately be completely and totally vulnerable with my spouse without fear because we both know that we rise and fall together. I could be completely vulnerable and I know I'm not going to be hit over the head because that would just bring her down. If you trust one another, if it's an ideal, that's what happens. And if you're lamenting the fact that you're not in a perfect ideal, focus on the ideal and we'll aim for it later, okay? Fruitful. Permanence helps fruitfulness, okay? God said to be fruitful and multiply, but God never tells us to do something in a chaotic manner, which is why he ordains us to be fruitful within the permanence of a sacramental marriage. That's where we're supposed to be fruitful, within the sacramental marriage, because kids are healthier when they have structure, when they feel safe, when they feel secure, when they are in the permanence of a sacramental marriage. So the permanence helps the fruitfulness as well. So let's go to the I do's, which Jake and Natalie and I were just talking about last week, and Lucy was there too. The husband, and in the I do's, in the sacrament of marriage, the husband and wife are actually the ministers of the sacrament. The priest is not the minister of the sacrament of marriage. Okay, minister for everything else, but for marriage, it's the husband and wife who administer the sacrament to each other and enter into the sacrament together. It's really important that their heads are on straight when they do this, which is why the priest asks 3 questions to make sure that their heads are in the right place. He says, have you come here freely and without reservation to give yourselves to each other in marriage? Freely and without reservation, free will. Second, will you love and honor each other as man and wife for the rest of your lives? There's that love and there's that permanence. And then will you accept children lovingly from God and bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? That's fruitfulness and teaching the faith. One more thing. Teaching the faith comes within a family. When we say I do to these questions, we use our free will to publicly declare that we are committing to love one another, to be faithful, to be steadfast, to be permanent, to have our love be fruitful and generate new life, and to teach the faith. Have you caught the common thread that runs through all of that? These are all things that God does, and a marriage echoes. God's love is faithful. permanent, it's fruitful, it generates new life, and God teaches the faith. This is why we say that the sacrament of marriage is a visible sign of the nature and the interior life of the very Trinity. One of the reasons why you can intuitively grasp what the Trinity is because you've seen good examples of a marriage. And you see that love, we see the production of life, we see the permanence, we see the faithfulness, we see the sacrifice for one another. And that gives us an intuitive sense of what the Trinity is, because we know what that is, because we're a sign. Those of us who are married, those of you who are going to getting married, you're going to be called to do that for everyone. So entering into a sacramental marriage is a call to be a good example of the love and constancy of God. The outward sign of this sacrament is the public promise of steadfast love between a husband and wife. And the ongoing love and commitment that they have for one another is the continuing sign for decades to come. Any good marriage, your good marriage, helps people understand God's love. So, does it sound a bit of a stretch to say that we help we're signs pointing to God? Sounds a little egotistical, but if you go through the Bible, it won't be that way. In the Old Testament, God the Father is very often described as wedding his people. That marriage motif is throughout the Old Testament. Okay? The concept of marriage is sacred. It's a sign of family. It's a sign of covenant. It's a description of the desired, indissoluble bond between God and his people. That's the marriage bond. In the New Testament, Jesus is often described as the bridegroom who's wedding the church. It's not just poetry, okay? The very first of Christ's miracles was at Cana, when he turned the water into wine at a wedding. It's an interesting part of this. You know who's responsible to bring the wine to a wedding? The bridegroom. In a very sneaky way, Jesus is revealing the fact that he's the bridegroom through that first miracle that we see. This foreshadows the wedding feast of the Lamb that we see all the way at the end of the Bible in Revelation. So, one of my favorite passages is the second half of Ephesians chapter 5, which is a very controversial passage, because some people take one sentence out and say, look how misogynistic, look how anti-woman it is. And if you read the whole thing, you don't get that impression, okay? It's incredible what's there. St. Paul explains there, makes it clear that the love and mutual sacrifice between husband and wife is one of the ways that we echo God's love into the world. He says, for this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. We've heard that now 3 times today, because it's said again in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 31. And in the very next verse, we're reminded by St. Paul of the parallel between the husband and wife bond and the God and his church bond. He says this, this is a great mystery, but I speak in reference to Christ and the church, which is a parallel to the husband and wife relationship. It's beautiful. The love and commitment in a marriage is a visible sign of the invisible connection between Christ and his church. That's the kind of sacrificial love, all-encompassing love that exists on the spiritual plane with Christ and his church, and exists more physically with us. If you want to truly understand how husbands and wives should treat each other in a sacramental marriage, then the second half of Ephesians chapter 5 is amazing. It says marriage is a husband and wife both exercising their free will in an attitude of love, striving towards each other's benefit. Now, I'm going to email you a link later tonight, or when this video goes online, so maybe tomorrow morning. And I'm going to link to you a section of a Bible study talk that I gave on the second half of Ephesians chapter 5. So, because I don't have time to cover it tonight. I just don't have the time. So I'm going to give you a link to that spot. If you are married, or are going to be married, or know someone who's married, you really want to check that out. It's amazing. Anyway, it's not that I'm amazing giving the talk. It's Paul was amazing, but I'm helping to explain it. So, marriage creates a covenant bond. And in Genesis chapter 2, when Adam sees Eve for the first time, he says, "This at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And we go, okay, there's another poetic way to say really cool stuff. I love her, that's wonderful. The phrase is significant, though, because elsewhere in the Old Testament, it's used explicitly to declare, this is my kinsman, this is family, okay? In 2 Samuel chapter 5, in Genesis chapter 29, there are people who are widely distant. They come together and they go, "You're bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." I mean, you're family. Marriage creates a family bond. It's not a throwaway phrase. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh is very important. Once we say I do, we enter into a covenant, which creates a family bond. And because a sacramental marriage is a covenant, it is unbreakable. This is the difference between a civil marriage and a sacramental marriage. I know I've covered this before in covenant, so I'll just say these two quick things. A civil marriage is a contract, and it can be easily dissolved by another contract, which is called a divorce. A sacramental marriage is a covenant, and it cannot be dissolved. There is no such thing as a Catholic divorce. It doesn't exist. Which brings us to the topic of annulment. A lot of people say, oh, annulments, that's just a Catholic word for divorce. No, it's not what it is. An annulment is not a Catholic divorce. An annulment cannot dissolve a valid sacramental marriage. Just can't happen. What happens when someone asks for an annulment is that the church will investigate whether or not the husband and wife actually entered into a sacramental marriage in the first place. They will go through various steps to try and figure that out. And if after the investigation they find that the sacrament was not valid, then the church issues an annulment. And that declaration is that the marriage never took place. For some reason, something was wrong and the sacrament did not take place in the first place. It's not I'm breaking it, I recognize it didn't happen in the first place. You're not divorced, you're single. And the status of any children is not affected because at the time the children were brought into the world, everyone considered a valid marriage. So there's no bad tinge on the kids. Okay? Their status is completely unchanged. To grant an annulment, the church needs to investigate and find some defect. Now, it could be that someone was not truthful in those three questions. Okay, their minds weren't in the right place. That's why the priest asked them to make sure their minds are in the right place when they enter into the sacrament, because they're the ministers of the sacrament. If their minds aren't in the right place, it's not a valid sacrament. So they might ask that. They might find some impediment or some defect in form. These investigations can be very complex and take a long time, or they can be incredibly fast if it's like a defect in form, because it's just simply, it just didn't happen correctly. Now, I'm not an expert, but I'll give you a couple of examples. Okay, just to give you a flavor, I'll give you a couple of examples. What if somebody was not truthful when they said that they were free to choose to enter a marriage? Right? They feared for their life because somebody had found out that somebody was pregnant and somebody's just sitting with a shotgun outside if they don't. You get the idea? They're not free to choose to say no. So they wouldn't be going into the sacrament with the free will ability, therefore the sacrament would be invalid. Now there's another very subtle way that the free will can be not present. And there's a very subtle threat to free will, which is what we call sliding into a marriage. This is where, okay, boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, boy and girl start having sex. Boy and girl realize the next time a lease comes up, why are we spending twice the amount on rent? Why don't we just move in together? Well, why don't we just combine our finances? Well, why don't we all have the friends in common. Everything's now in common. They're doing everything that a married couple would do. And then the last thing to do is just to sort of say yes and get the marriage. They're sliding into marriage. And what takes place when that happens is the person's making the last 5% decision. They're not making the full decision. You follow that? Okay? 95% of it's already done. And they just say, okay, that's not a true mature decision. And sometimes somebody, for financial reasons or whatever, it would be very difficult to say no at that point in time. So they're not coerced by someone else, they're coerced by the situation itself. That would be an example of not being free to say no. not being truly free to say no. Okay? What if one person was not truthful about their intent to have children? Well, that would make the sacrament invalid. What if someone was not truthful about their intent to be faithful? Well, then the sacrament would be invalid. But what if somebody had an affair, but on the day they were married, they were truthful about their intent to be faithful, but then they failed afterward? Sacramental. Their intent was there at the beginning. They entered into a sacramental marriage, and then we've got a problem. But it's sacramental. The failure down the road does not, we all fail. The failure down the road doesn't mess it up. The sacrament was entered into validly. What if somebody wasn't truthful about a lifelong intent? They literally stood up there and they said, well, they say until death do us part, but you know what? Everybody says you just stick around until he or she really starts to bug you, and then you bail. So, yeah, I'm going to say yes, but I don't really mean it. Well, if they don't really mean it, then no, the sacrament's not valid. But what happens now? Follow along with me on this one. Father Gavin and I talked about this one lunch, and it stuck with me, so I'm going to pass it along to you. What happens if after lying on that day, this person's lying, they only want to stick around until it still stops being fun. But then once they're in the marriage, the love grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. And then 40 years later, they're still together. And they couldn't possibly think about being separated at that point. It's now a lifelong marriage. But it wasn't intended on the day one. Is God going to bless that marriage? Did he bless it on day one? Is God messed up by time? Did God know that this was going to happen this day? Yes. So he blesses the marriage on day one because he knows that it's going to stay. Okay? Even though one of them wasn't in the right frame of mind at that time, he knows the love's going to grow and it's going to happen. So there's interesting things when you start thinking about this. And when you start thinking about the ideal and where those defects take place, you can understand how to piece it together, which is why I'm going through this. Okay? So God bestows grace on that marriage from day one. Now, an error in form, not just the questions, okay, but an error in form could be as simple as, well, you didn't have two witnesses at the wedding. That's part of the form of a sacramental marriage. You have to have two witnesses. If you don't have two witnesses, it's not a sacramental marriage. Okay, that's a real quick one to take care of. You didn't have a priest present. That's a problem. Okay, that would be thrown out. Or not thrown out, but that would be considered not, if it was looked at, it would be considered not valid. Now, what happens when a Catholic marries a non-Catholic, and let's say he's marrying her, she's Methodist, and she wants to be married in the church she grew up in. She loves that church. So she says she wants to be married in the Methodist church, okay? So they go and get married in the Methodist church. Well, that's not valid. But if he went to the Catholic Church first and said, this is the situation, she wants to be married over here, can I get what's called a dispensation? Can I get married over here? Chances are the church will say, yeah, sure, okay, going to check out the information, but yeah, okay. And then this marriage, the same place, okay, outside the Catholic Church, but now it's considered okay because he went and got a dispensation ahead of time. Now, so what happens when you've got, some of you are coming into the church now and you weren't married in the Catholic Church and you're going, is my marriage valid? Hui and Tia, for instance, okay? Lutherans, married in Lutheran church. Your wedding is valid, okay? Because both of you were Lutheran, the Catholic Church recognizes that as a valid marriage. Okay, neither one of you had the responsibility to come out to the Catholic Church and ask for a dispensation. You weren't Catholic at the time. Valid sacramental marriage, not a problem. Okay, we only have this problem where it's mixed like that, because once you're Catholic, you've got this responsibility to make sure that it's correct. Anyway, that's that. Now, if you're sitting here and you go, well, I got married in a courthouse, that's not a valid sacramental marriage. You can cure that through what's called a convalidation. If you've got some sort of error, you're listening to me and you're like the sweat's rolling down your face. I'm not married. Yeah, don't worry. We can cure that through what's called a convalidation. What happens is you come to the church, and it can be a very simple ceremonial, like a Tuesday afternoon with 5 people there, or it could be a whole big wedding if you want it to be. A convalidation just says, there's something in error, and we're going to fix it, okay? So it just sort of takes care of it. And because God is not affected by time, he's blessed it from the very beginning, provided, of course, you fix it. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of different situations. I've touched on a handful of them, and If you need help, contact me. I may not have the answer, but I can put you in touch with somebody who does know a lot more than I do. So, next. Did I supposed to click on anything there? Nope. Done. Okay, next. The domestic church. Each family is a domestic church. It's where the family practices the faith. It's where they pass that faith along to their family. I love this line up here. Within holy families, children first learn the basic virtues of justice, charity, forgiveness, and generosity. Wouldn't it be great if all the kids growing up right now knew those 4 things well because their domestic church, their family passed those along? Very nice. This is where good citizens are formed. Good people are formed. It's for the good of society. There's another line that comes right after this in the book that I stole this from. It says, the family is the vital cell of society on which civilization itself depends. The enemies of God in modern culture are trying everything they can do right now to tear down the family from all angles. They say, marriage, you want to get married? No, just live together. Permanence, forget permanence. Just stick around until he or she stops making you happy. Kids, no, carbon footprint. You don't want to have kids. That's bad. They're even going after the very definition of man and woman, which is insane to me, but they're doing that. They're trying everything they can to tear apart the domestic church, as it says here, the vital cell of society on which civilization depends. This is why we need to know this ideal. We need to know what this is. We need to stand up for it. They're trying to erase it. But see, God knows the ingredients for the best possible relationship, and he gives it, and he gives us that information. We should be listening. Last thing. Grace. In a sacramental marriage, you receive grace. God recognizes that a lifelong commitment through imperfect people that we all are, a lifelong commitment is incredibly difficult. It requires a lot of love, a lot of strength, and a lot of sacrifice. He also knows that the very concept of family is under attack. So this is why God grants us a huge, heaping portion of sanctifying grace inside a sacramental marriage. This grace helps us to love the way God loves, helps us to forgive the way God forgives, and helps us to sacrifice the way God has sacrificed. Forgiving is very important in a permanent relationship because not everybody's perfect. In short, it helps us to become saints for one another. Holy matrimony is one of the 2 sacraments of service. We talked last week about holy orders. This is the other sacrament of service. We are meant to be a light to the world. And we are meant to be of service to one another. Lucy loves this last line. Sacrifice is always tedious and irksome. Love can make it bearable. And perfect love makes it a joy. She loves that line, and I can understand why. I pray that each of you, whether you're married or not, receive an abundance of God's grace so that you can approach that perfection of love. Thanks for listening. God bless you. God bless our country. And God bless the church all throughout the world.